We all are gonna die. 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 Why don't we help each other prepare for it? Without death there could not be life. I'm talking about end of life conversations, conversations about the end of life. Death and dying, grief and loss, conversations about the end of life.
I just think that ability to listen, and that's something that anybody, whether they're a doula or not, but anybody who is going into that end of life space, if they can practice their listening skills and try their very best to put themselves on the shelf a bit, that can be immensely helpful for your loved one.
Ultimately, a good death doula is someone who can listen deeply and who understands the complexities involved in end-of-life care and can hold space in a way that is grounded and informed and genuinely present.
Welcome to the End of Life Conversations podcast. I'm Reverend Wakil David Matthews.
And I'm the Reverend Mother Ana Luisa Armendariz. In this podcast, we share people's experiences with death and dying, whether it's grief and loss, joy and celebration, all things related to the end of life.
We so enjoy all our insightful and passionate guests who generously tell their stories with compassion and wisdom. So let's get started.
Welcome to our Doula podcast. You may have heard of birth doulas, and if you've been listening to our podcast, you will have heard about death doulas or end-of-life or grief counselors. Today, we want to introduce you to some of these death doulas, all of who have been on the podcast before. So be sure to check out the episodes where we have them. And we hope that you'll learn more about what they do and how they do it.
Death doulas are becoming more prevalent in end-of-life support. They are trained to support those at the end of life, really through the whole spectrum, from before to well after, and support their families and their communities as well. We really hope this conversation will help you find a death doula who can support you during an end-of-life event. We will include links to their work, their websites, and podcast episodes in the show notes, so please check those out. So let's get started. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
So let's let you each tell us about yourself. Where are you located, first of all? And then if you have any specialty concentrations in your work, please go ahead and tell us about that. On my far left is Laura. So Laura, I'll let you start.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having me again today.
Yeah.
It's nice to see everybody. My name is Laura Musselman, and I am an end-of-life doula. I began my work in end-of-life care probably about 8 years ago now. I trained with the International End-of-Life Doula Association, ANELDA, and I still work pretty part-time as a death doula, but my full-time job is now with the Humane Prison Hospice Project as their Director of Development and Communications.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you. And where are you located?
I'm in the Bay Area of California, but I am from the Central Valley. So I travel back and forth a lot. I still do actually a lot of work with clients in the Central Valley as well. There's a big need there and not as big of a concentration of people doing this specific work. So,
yeah, great. And yeah, do listen to her podcast to hear more about the prison project, which is really amazing. And check out her website. Great. Thank you. Layla, how about you?
I am Layla Kelly, and I live in Helena, Montana. I have been a doula for, I think, about 4 years now, and I trained with Going with Grace with Elua Arthur. I saw a TED Talk that she did, and at the time I was trying to figure out how I could help people, and I had this idea of this thing that maybe I could do, and she got on and started talking about my idea, and I was just like, there's somebody for me. So I was super excited when I realized that I wasn't the only one who was thinking along these lines. And I really find value in helping people with preparation, hopefully before they face a crisis. Unfortunately, that's not how the human being tends to work. But I do find that people find great comfort when they start making plans for themselves. It gives people a sense of autonomy. And that is so important when it comes to end of life care. And then the other piece that I am really passionate about is helping families to realize that they can be involved in after death care to whatever degree they're comfortable with.
Oh, yeah.
I know that that is a profound thing for me. And I have seen the way it helps my clients when they engage in it too. So those are probably the two biggest areas that I find myself just yammering on about constantly.
All right. Thank you, Layla. Okay, let's see. Let's go down to Karen.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here again also. I live in the San Gabriel Valley, which is in the eastern part of Los Angeles. And I've been in practice as a death doula since 2021. My real specialty is actually just to hold space in the time that leads up to and including the vigil when the dying person is actively dying. So I guess I could say my concentration is on ushering my client through the transition and across the threshold, and then also continuing to hold that space for the loved ones of the dying person. I like to meet outside in nature in my first meeting, if possible, and do a little bit of breath work and energy rising to get them connected to their feeling and sensing states. And one of my specialties is working with sound. I use a crystal heart chakra sound bowl. And as a member of Threshold Choir, I sometimes use soft, ethereal, celestial music at the bedside for comfort. And I also specialize in creating a beautiful farewell ceremony so that the dying person's loved ones can find a way of honoring and holding that space of love after they're gone.
Thank you. Beautiful. Wonderful. Okay, Myra, you're up.
Well, the dog isn't barking right now, so fingers crossed. So I've been doing this work for about 8 years now. I didn't go and get my doula certificate until Karen and I got them about the same time. Both of us got them through ANELDA. ANELDA's been amazing. They're really good at furthering education. And so, yeah, they've been wonderful. And I came to this work as a photographer, oddly enough, because I was doing pro bono work. I'm going to do this quickly because we did it in the other episode I was in. But I was doing pro bono work as a photographer for unhoused and at-risk communities in the Nevada area. And so in that work, I came across people who were in the streets, who were newly released from prison, who were just transient and got stuck, and a lot of women and children. And it turns out an enormous amount of elderly folks and folks who are sick and cannot afford health care are dying on the street. So I came in contact with that, and kind of it changed my life in a lot of ways, because I felt like photography is so good for witnessing and bringing awareness, but it wasn't a practical application of service that I could provide. And so I really started thinking about how can I provide real service to people who are at the end of their lives. And then so that's where it started. Obviously, photography is one of the specialties that I offer. I will do end-of-life photography of family members for the dying, so they can be surrounded by photos of the people they love, photography for memorial services. So that's a given. But I also, my key focus is providing comfort, especially to people at the end of their lives, working really hard to make sure that every single day, every single moment until their last breath is as good as we can possibly make it. That's my goal. I am in the business of life until the very last breath. So as a death doula, I really view death as that final moment at the end of a good life. And so every single moment, I'm aiming for them to be as comfortable as possible. So I really like to work in tandem with hospice and with family members and really grow a team of care and support around that dying person. That's my goal.
Beautiful.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah. And did you say where you were from? Where you're working?
I'm sorry. I'm in Los Angeles proper, and I serve all of Southern California.
Great. Wonderful.
Great. I have a lot of West Coast folks here in our Montana. Thank you so much for telling us about the lovely work that you all do as death doulas. And if you could just think back to that moment when you were inspired to become a death doula, what would that moment have been like? What could you share about that for our listeners? And we'll start with Laura again.
Yeah, that's an easy one for me to pinpoint. An only child who had the great misfortune of having both of my parents die within a span of 2 years when I was in my 20s. And my mother was the first to die. She died from early onset Alzheimer's disease. The trajectory was about 5-6 years, so fairly quick. And the day that she died, I remember pacing around outside of her room, kind of wondering, like, who's the first person I should call? I called, a couple of family members who were vaguely supportive, but kind of didn't really know how to, I think, support me in that moment, and definitely didn't have any guidance for me. My parents, neither of them were people who really wanted to spend a lot of time talking about their deaths or, what they wanted or what they thought it should be like. And so, at the end of the day, I was just a person who didn't know what I was supposed to do next because nobody had told me. And the people who were supposed to tell me were now unable to. And it was kind of just this moment of, I really wish there was somebody I could call who could tell me what I'm supposed to do now. In just very practical terms, like, do I call the funeral home? Do I do this? And I had a lot of interest in end-of-life care from a really young age. I was a philosophy major in college. I taught philosophy for like 10 years in college. And so I think I just had this kind of intrinsic drive to want to be the person who not necessarily could give the answers, but at least guide people to where they could find the answers. And I just sort of decided I would do that.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. And directly beside Laura, Laila.
For me, I, like Laura, have always kind of been drawn to that time of life for people. I think that's just something that most people who become doulas kind of have as an innate quality. And I had a friend, she died 12 years ago. I think in April of this year, it'll be 12 years. She was a single woman in her 50s. She didn't have any children, but she had a bunch of friends who really loved her, a bunch of very well-intentioned friends who loved her, but they didn't know how to let her take the reins of her own death. And so people were, like I say, really well-intentioned, but they were just making all sorts of decisions for her. And you could see that some of them did not align with what she wanted, and so just kind of like low-level drama ensued and hurt feelings here and there and just all this stuff happening around a dying woman. And she was the thing that needed to be at the center of it. And I just learned watching that just like, this could be done better. Death could be done so much better if we just had a little organization, if there was somebody there. And that's when I really started that thought process of, there's got to be a way to do that, because so many people, they don't know what to do. Just like Laura had said, we don't naturally know, who do I call next? What do I do for this? But that's where doulas can come in, and they can, for lack of a better word, save the day when it comes to kind of putting everything in order and just making people's death as peaceful and as possible, and making the death theirs and all about them.
I love that.
Yeah, lovely.
Too. Next on my screen would be Karen.
Yeah. I was mainly inspired by my previous experiences with family members. I had the great fortune of actually being very close to their journey. My grandmother, and actually just recently my dad, passed January 5th, and was by his side, was by my grandmother's side, and my brother-in-law about 15 years ago. So I felt like I had sort of been taking some kind of preparation course or something. And then after the pandemic, after being locked down in Italy for 3 months and really sort of confronting the very real possibility of dying myself and seeing so much death around like so many people did during the pandemic, I came back here and had recently retired and was really sort of I was exploring different pathways during that time. And on New Year's Eve of 2021, I sat down and did a meditation and put out an intention, and that I wanted to find some way of serving others and finding a passionate way to be in my life. And I opened my computer the next day, and there it was. I
Submissive.
saw Doula and I saw Inelda, and I signed up for the training, and the rest is history.
Wonderful. And Mira, what was it like for you?
Well, I came up with a lot of the generational angst around me. A lot of my companions committed suicide when I was in high school and college, and I had a lot of family members die. And, I felt like I was surrounded by death a lot growing up. And I think just my awareness of it was always kind of forefront. My grandfather's death was quite defining for me because he was my father figure. And I found myself at 15 comforting, my uncle on the front steps, which should have been the other way around, but that was just, I fell very naturally into that role. So I've always been really comfortable with the end of life and confronted it, as a concept for a very long time. But really, I just thought, oh, that's just my personality. I just have, I'm real fun at parties. I can...
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about things at a party, and the next thing you know, I've got us talking philosophy, So I just thought that's just how I behave. But then, of course, like I was saying, I was working pro bono as a photographer and actually coming, face to face with people who just didn't have any resources, didn't know who to call, going to these events that were put on by Nevada Homeless Alliance where they would provide resources or at least give them outlets to find resources. But a lot of times there's not a lot that these organizations can do because these people cannot access healthcare. They don't know where their social security card is. They don't have a driver's license. They don't have access to buses, and a bus pass is only good for one day, So that's when I started really thinking about tangible ways. Okay, so who are the people that bridge the gap between medical and funeral care versus that interim section of end of life care, the moments before death? Who helps with that? And then after they pass and all of those organizations forget them, who helps them grieve? Right. So that was what made me really start to look into the idea of becoming a death doula.
Yeah. And, it's that unknowing. We don't live in a culture where we see natural episodes of dying in our family members' lives so that we can have information handed to us as we go along. And not all information is the right information either, right? Like I recently asked a friend called and said, if my spouse dies, she has long-term cancer, she could, die anytime. And he said, I suddenly realized nobody's told me who to call. Yeah. Like, do I call 911? Do I call a funeral home? And it was in that moment when I realized a death doula would be so helpful for this family, right? Because the questions, and if she doesn't, or she or he doesn't know the answer, they go out and find the answers so that those loved ones around the dying person can continue to hold that space rather than frantically spending time on the internet or making phone calls and, just getting kind of swept along away from the sacred moments that are happening. So I really appreciate so much how all of you have seen this firsthand and stepped into that role.
Yeah. It's really inspiring. And I think a lot of people, hopefully people listening to this will notice their own inspiration and or know that this is a really excellent resource. Thank you. That was really, I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed by all of it.
Well, I'm just grateful all of these beautiful people are in our world and helping others, right? Like,
Yeah. And these are, kind of a representation. And even though they're on the West Coast, they're everywhere. They're not only on the West Coast. So it's really good to know that this is available to folks. And there are good resources in Delta, and others are good resources for people. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So just wondering if any of you have a story you would like to share, kind of about what you, when you've worked with somebody that would exemplify all the work that you do and how you serve the dying and their beloveds.
I can go first this time.
Yeah,
I literally just concluded with a client on Monday. And it was a special case because, as Karen knows, because it was 2 months of care. And usually, we know people for a couple of days, a week before they pass. So it was a very unusual circumstance. And I wound up working as basically an interim care provider for about 2 months for him and his family. And being their doula for a full 2 months, which is such a different end result, and the process is so different from just walking in and meeting somebody, saying you're going to help them take their MAID medication, and then you don't see them again, so it was very unique for me and very beautiful and full of learning. And so in that case, I can't really give you details about the case, but I can tell you some of the things we did. The gentleman was 90 years old and lived with his wife. So they were elderly, and he had a terminal illness, but it didn't have an end date. So he couldn't get into hospice. So that is always a real issue. What we wound up doing is he wanted to come in and he wanted to do VSED, which is voluntary stopping eating and drinking. That's how I initially came into the case. And so we had meetings with the family. We did a lot of that kind of stuff where I informed the family about processes and what to expect and things of that nature, answered questions. I went to visits with him to his doctors to help his doctors get on board. And then through that work of talking with his doctors, I was able to convince the doctors to get that hospice order signed. And in the meantime, I'm visiting the home many hours a day, providing basically hospice care. And he was a huge fan of massage. So I was massaging him full body for like 4 times a day, doing the dishes, doing the laundry, making sure his bed was clean, all that stuff. Wow. So the practical stuff, and also helping them with their paperwork, making sure that was all in order, doing videos for his VSED so that there was a legal video of him saying what his wishes were, right? So we did all those types of things. And then after he was able to get signed into hospice, MAID became available. So we were able to create a MAID date for him, which is medical aid in dying. For those who don't know, I know you guys do, but and that was a miracle. It was like it changed the entire landscape of how he was going to be able to say goodbye to his family. He was going to be able to, instead of fading off through VSED, he was going to be able to be present and himself until the very last minute. And it was such a blessing to the whole family. So without going into detail about the case itself, I can tell you that that's like the scope of 2 months of work. And there were days I was there for 13 hours a day, a lot. There were days where I came and went a lot, which is, so it's just you do what's needed. It is kind of my approach. I figure out what they need, and then I try to meet that gap. And if I can't, I try to find people who can. So I don't know if that's what you're asking exactly, but.
Oh yeah, that's perfect.
It is. And it's one kind of support that can be given by a death doula. And I just want to point out, this is not normal to do 13-hour days, I presume. So I want people to hear that and say, this is an exceptional case. And a listener may have that type of an exceptional case and can ask for this type of service. And, yes, they're all different. And that's what we're trying to.
Yeah, this was very different, but not in the particulars, like not in the ways that the things that we all do. Right. Like, right. So it was special. And I'm still processing that.
Right.
Yeah. And I would assume that in that kind of a case, you'd only have one client at a time.
Right.
Yeah. There's no way I could have had another client. Yeah. Whereas when I'm doing MAID cases, I can see multiples in a week, So it's very different every time. And every single client, I feel like we're learning something.
Yeah, exactly.
And every human is having a very different experience too, which is, with the beauty and the mystical part of this job. And, it's all going to be new every single time.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody lives and dies in their own unique way.
Yes.
We've heard that many times. So Karen, do you have a good story you could share with us?
I have a story. It's very different from what Myra was discussing, but I think that's good because just the scope of our practice is very, it's multi-layered. And this experience I also can't give too many details, but I'll just say.
And All of us know that, right? It's like
Yeah.
no details. It's an overview.
For the sake of privacy, just my client, John. And John was in the last stages. It was about 2 weeks before he passed. And I was doing regular visits with them. And he and his wife had 2 children, a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old boy. And the client's parents were also in the home from out of town. They were staying in the nearby area, but they were in the home a lot. And John's father had some very firm ideas about discipline and how you deal with children. And at one point, the little 6-year-old boy did not want to go into the room to see his dad. He was terrified and he just refused to go in there. And the father became very disgruntled and angry and blamed the mother for not having proper discipline, for teaching the child that he must support his father and show him love. And just as an aside, from the time I arrived on the scene, the father actually ignored me and didn't make any effort to interact with me at all, although the mother and I were becoming close, and I was providing a lot of support for her as well, which I just let him have his space. I recognized that he was in a tremendous amount of pain and losing his son, and did not pressure him at all to interact with me. I just was there and holding space for the whole family. And when I spoke with John about the situation, it was just one day when I was there, and he disclosed to me that he was having the situation with his dad. He was very upset about it. He didn't know what to do, and he didn't have the strength to manage that kind of dynamic. And I just held space for him and listened and just provided the kind of guidance that we do. And eventually he said that he felt that he needed to talk to his father. And I left him that day. And I think it was about 5 days later, I came back and he was very relieved and at peace with the situation. He said that he had talked to his father. His father had apologized to his wife and realized that he had overstepped his bounds and the whole situation had been resolved. And it was very interesting because after John died, the day he died, the parents came over to the house. And once the father went in to see John and said his goodbyes and came out, and he just looked at me and came towards me, and I held out my arms and he just gave me this full embrace and started sobbing. Just broke down. And it was just such a beautiful moment. And the next day, when we were grief processing, just going over what had gone on, he just completely opened up and talked about, how difficult it had been for him. And he was aware that he had been difficult with others. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful process. And I think that is one of the aspects of our practice and our work that is just so fulfilling and helpful and supportive.
Wow.
That is great to
Beautiful.
hear. And it's a lot, right? But I love that you've had the training to support not just the person who is in process of dying, but to recognize what's going on around it, be receptive to whatever they might need, but not overstep it. Your focus is on the person who's dying. And so that is, a lot of families find themselves in fraught situations when someone is dying. Like, for any number of reasons. So the fact that death doulas are trained to listen and hopefully help navigate those tricky waters is really, it's invaluable.
Yeah.
So
I feel like that's true whether you're in a situation where the family supports the decision or doesn't support the decision, because that fraught tension is going to exist in one way or another. It's not always because there's like outward tension. It's the tension of somebody's dying, and it's amazing how it comes out.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, that's so true. And it's so good to really hear that and recognize that when if you're going through this, and to have people around who know the work. And that must be, in some ways, imagine that's some of the hardest work to do, because you've got to also be connected to yourself and your own center and your own ground to be able to be present for others. So thank you for that. Laila, do you have a story to share with us?
It's not so much that I have a specific story, but as I was listening to Karen talk, I realized that the thread that has gone through every single client that I have worked with has been that listening piece. Because yeah, whatever is going on, there's the family dynamic thing that might be going on. And yes, there's going to be that underlying tension, and it's going to bubble up at different times. And if you can listen to them and let them just say what they need to say so that they can move forward, listening to the client so that you can hear what they actually need. And even I have one right now that's a long distance situation where I know the client. She is my client in a different world that I work in, and it's her brother who's dying, and she is trying to take care of him. And she was telling me, I just asked her, how's it going? And she was just mentioning a couple little things. And like one of the things that she just said is, he goes from he's sleeping 21 hours a day, and then he wakes up and says, I got to go get a job. And, and she's commenting on this. And I was just like, oh, you need to talk to him about that job. Because that can signal a transition that he's trying to make. And this is, and it's just, these are just little things. But if that is one of the things we're trained to do, is listen and pick up on those little things. Yeah, I won't go into all of what that transition can mean, that what he was saying there with that, or what he might be saying with that. But I just think that ability to listen, and that's something that anybody, whether they're a doula or not, but anybody who is going into that end of life space, if they can practice their listening skills and try their very best to put themselves on the shelf a bit, that can be immensely helpful for your loved one.
Yeah. So true. Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, Laura, you had a story for us?
I do. I've been sitting here kind of thinking about a couple of different stories that come to mind, but I think the one that probably exemplifies best the scope of work that we do and why it's useful is one that it happened a few years ago. I was actually working at a hospice. So this situation kind of organically evolved from, being at work in that setting and wearing that hat, and then after hours putting on a different hat. But the person in question was a 3-month-old baby. And I think this is one of those situations that's worth talking about, because for me, the whole experience really highlighted how unprepared so many people are to work with a patient that age, even if you're a person who has a lot of hospice experience and you've been at the bedside of, so many people. There's something about the loss of a child, of an infant, that is really, really provocative for a lot of people. And, for me, this was obviously a situation where I couldn't ask my client, my patient, what it was that they wanted. For me, it was, if I'm going to spend 3 months on this earth, I'd want to just be held. But there was a lot of judgment kind of from a lot of angles in that situation where, the parents were being judged for choices they'd made for their baby's care, their lack, and I'm putting this in quotes, their lack of presence in the situation. These were parents who were completely blindsided by the situation, who had 3 other children at home who they were caring for and trying to be present for. And, so for me in that situation, it was so important to just introduce physical touch, holding, and quiet to the situation, and to really kind of try to negotiate with anybody coming in and out of the room that it was not a space to speculate about why these grieving, shell-shocked parents were making the choices they were making, and who were ultimately there for their child the moment that they died. And, my hat was off to them for balancing all the things that they were balancing, and also so much gratitude that they trusted me enough to be that person, with their child. Again, this was a case many, many hours of a day. I would, finish my hospice shift, go home, take a bit of a breather, eat something, and then come back into the early hours of the morning just to be present. So yeah, that's one of those situations that is unique. And I was thinking also while I was talking that I didn't discuss up front any of my kind of specialty areas, but I have a friend, another death doula, who jokes that I tend to work in the fringiest of fringy death spaces.
Love it.
And it is one of those things where I realized, I'm kind of watching these very experienced, very professional people around me fall apart because of this, and not for no good reason. But for whatever reason, I kind of discovered I had a knack for staying calm in those situations and recognizing that although it's such a delicate situation, that doesn't mean that the need is less. If anything, I think the need is more because it's also so isolating for that family and so difficult to talk about. Yeah, really open to a lot of kind of judgmental responses from people who you would hope would not necessarily come into the space that way. So it was a good moment to have a death doula.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
I appreciate you standing there and, holding that space for that little family.
That does become our role a lot. We become that dam wall between, judgment or, people coming in to spaces with the wrong energy. That's part of our job is to say, nope, that's, I respect what you're going through, but that's not what we're doing right now.
Yeah. I think it's hard for people, no matter how long you've been working in end-of-life care or healthcare, to not kind of project your own feelings and grief onto a situation. And it really requires that very basic return to just being present. Like, what is happening here in the moment? What is needed? What can I give? And like, what needs to be kept out of this space to make it as good as possible?
Safe. Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm so moved by the spectrum of care I hear here and the spectrum of love and compassion.
Yes. And, also what I hear, thank you, Laura, for sharing that as your story. And, we heard about MAID, where somebody decides to end their life at a certain time. We have elders who are passing, right? So we have a spectrum of death care that we death helpers help with, right? And so for the listener, I want them to hopefully have this moment and think about, like, it's not just for my parents that I can start thinking about this. This is about my friends who might be having children. And if something goes sideways for my friend, I can say, listen, we might want to have a death doula with us. And, especially with parents, like, they don't get this information because the perceived notion of the industrialized medical system is like, we're going to get through this, but maybe we don't. And a death doula would be just the most divine entity to show up in that moment, right? And so based on all your stories, though, I want to discuss payment. How are you compensated for this time? And it's really interesting to me that we have somebody who on one occasion spent 13 hours a day, and sometimes I've been with people who it's only for a week because that's it. Like, they just got sick and it's the end. So in a nutshell for you, when you have people coming to ask you, tell me what you would respond and, like, how do you get paid? Layla.
So I also am on the board of funeral industry in my state. And I just wish that everything was super transparent when it came to end of life, that we didn't have to, do work to find out what things cost. So on my website, you could clearly see prices just because that's the way I work. And that's how I want to work. And so I do have things that I do that are just hourly, and it really depends on who I'm approaching. If I'm going to be with somebody, maybe I'm doing really practical things for them. Their death maybe is not imminent. So then I'll just do an hourly rate. If I do my end of life planning, that's kind of a package rate for that. And then when push comes to shove and we're actually in the dying process, that is where my rates really get all loosey-goosey, because I just can never bring myself to charge hourly for how much work I put in. I kind of know what the hourly would be, and then generally it's just reaching a point that feels right, and there just has to be an exchange in there. So, I do put a specific price so that people could kind of know what they're getting into with me, and then it all is just very flexible, just because it has to be. This just can't be a hard and fast. That doesn't feel right. So that's how I do it.
Beautiful. Yeah, who else would like to tell us about this part? This has been something we've had several conversations about, because it can be a little challenging. I mean, we're all here because we are compassionate, loving people who want to give service. And so to even charge at all sometimes feels like, I don't want to do that,
Yeah.
But it's important. It's important. So yeah, go ahead, Myra.
Yeah, I was just going to say what Layla is talking about, that you're kind of adjusting as the client's needs become obvious. So if I'm doing MAID, I have a flat fee that I charge straight up. I keep it very, very simple and straightforward. And it's about half of the industry standard, because that's just the way I broke it down for myself. If I'm doing VSED, that's going to be more of a package deal, and we're going to go week by week, right? Because there's going to be some time ahead of starting VSED, there's going to be the VSED process. I will say I always try to make sure they aren't paying me a bill on the day of ingestion or on the day of death. I try to be very, very conscious of that. I try to be very transparent about what things are going to cost ahead of time. I don't try, I am. I'm very, very, very clear about that kind of thing. But also, I work on a sliding scale a lot. If it's very obvious that somebody has financial challenges, I'm not going to charge them my MAID flat fee. I'm going to adjust according to what I'm seeing in front of me. And so this is where the kind of experiential aspect comes into play. You really start to draw on your own life experience, understanding what you're seeing in front of you, listening for what they're not saying, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have things that are flat fees. Like if, I'm a maker and a musician. So if I'm doing music or making a legacy project with you, that's going to have a very specific fee schedule and parameters, right? If I'm going to be coming in every week and doing a certain amount of hours, I'm not going to charge you hourly. I'm going to charge you for the week, right? And there's going to be really clear communication on that. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, nice. I think that last thing you said is the most important thing, communication. Right? Yeah, people need to know why they're paying what they're paying.
Right.
100%.
So, yeah. Karen or Laura?
I think it's a really tricky issue, actually, because our industry is so still evolving and there's not a lot of awareness. I've had experiences where someone will come to me and they don't really understand exactly what my role is. So they start inquiring about the service, and then we talk about payment. I have similar, just like the others, I have a flat fee rate for like an hourly. And then I have service packages. I offer memoir writing as one of my services. So I have sort of a package of memoir writing service. And I've had clients where it became clear to me that they really didn't have the funds at all. I just recently had a client inquire, and it was her mother. And her mother was a retired school teacher and had a reverse mortgage and barely had money to pay for the care that she was receiving. And, I got into a discussion with this woman who ended up being, turns out she has a nonprofit helping women in business. And she said, I really want to help your industry because this is ridiculous that there's not some kind of support and benefit available to people for this service. And I ended up offering pro bono, my work pro bono for them, but she ended up not needing the service because her mother went so quickly. And so I was just there telling her that if she needed any help, please contact me. But so I think it's really about communication and about sort of listening again and figuring out what's possible for the dying person, their family. And I am in the fortunate position of not having to use this as my primary financial support, but I do think it's very important because people feel that there is more value to the service you're providing if they do have to pay for it.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, my answer is not much different than anybody else's. I do have a price sheet that outlines as clearly as possible, like an hourly rate, a flat rate for certain things, you know, aid in dying, flat rate. I guess the true answer is it's very, very, very sliding scale. And it is so dependent on so many things, like the extent of the needs, but also how that person's approaching me. Because sometimes I get inquiries where they very much understand that there's some aspect of a business transaction here. But I also get inquiries from people where maybe they just need a phone call to kind of suss out their options or, you know, get a few quick practical answers about where to go next. And, you know, the honest truth is I think probably 90% of any doula work I do now is really pretty pro bono. You know, I started doing this. I don't think I've tried to think of this as something I would make a full-time living from, maybe ever, which is why I also like have my other full-time job. I got into this because I thought it was important to, you know, reestablish that position of like being a member of a community who can kind of provide this guidance. And I guess there are cases where it makes a lot more sense to charge people. That's what they're expecting. I think it makes sense to charge people for our labor, which is a lot. I think it makes sense to put a charge on it for, you know, the respect that the work deserves. And at the same time, I don't personally feel good, you know, having like a phone call with somebody who's in need, in crisis, and then saying, okay, well, that was 45 minutes and my hourly rate is this. And so I'm going to, I just don't even charge for that.
Yeah, that's you know, that's what I have on my website. Do you just need to know what's out there? Just give me a call. You know? Yeah.
And even when they're kind of beyond discovery, like I really I don't know. It's such a lame answer probably, but a lot of it comes down to just that intuition. Like, here's where your needs are. Here's where your expectations are. Here's what I'm going to be offering. And so we kind of go from there. This is either going to be just totally pro bono, or I'm going to charge you this hourly rate and we're going to be really transparent and clear about that and involve a contract. Or you've come to me because of aid in dying and that's a flat rate, and you kind of go from there.
It's a good point though, because we do have to, at some point, if we're doing this a lot, we do have to charge because resource becomes an issue. We have to have the resources, whether that's physical, emotional, or financial, to provide for our clients. And so you're always dancing that dance of, you know, how do I make sure I can keep doing this work?
Right.
And one of those things is you do have to take a variety of clients who can pay you and clients who might not be able to. And it helps you find that even keel, I think, as well. You know, the clients who have means often tell me you don't charge enough. But in my mind, I'm charging enough so that if I have my next client who cannot pay me, it evens out. Do that. I can provide for that person. It's what Laura's saying. You're just always trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Which I think is why it's always such a tricky conversation. Like I remember, you know, years ago when I first kind of started doing this, I got so stuck on like, oh my God, what do I charge? What's my hourly rate? You know, and I'm looking at what like birth doulas in my area charge, and I'm kind of basing it off of that. And the truth is that once you get into it and once you're doing it, I mean, I've found just in my own experience that those conversations about cost and payment with clients come about actually pretty organically.
Yeah.
Like there's definitely people who they don't really know what they're looking for, and maybe they don't need much. They just need somebody to kind of get them turned in the right direction. And then there are people who are absolutely coming to you with like, these are the needs. I understand that this is a service I'm paying for, and you proceed as such.
I'm curious if some of you other doulas have run into, you know, you'll go to another doula website and the costs are so inflated. And you're sitting there going, why are they charging so much for that? Like, I see that all the time.
Well, and I was just actually going to point out, I love this conversation because I too charge for my services. I too wish I didn't have to charge for my services. I have sometimes worked through a funeral home who takes half of what I charge, right? So I wonder if some services are under the umbrella of another organization who takes a part of that charge, right?
Sure.
So for listeners, like if you go directly to a doula, you know, it's probably straight cost. But if you're finding it through a funeral home who offers some of these, it will that money will not go directly 100% to the provider. I think that's actually pretty true.
Yeah.
And I also want to point out that we are all people who have taken a lot of certification classes. We've done a lot of training work. I spend money on supervision. I spend money on therapy. I spend money on my spiritual direction. So we come to fellow humans in support and in love with a lot of training behind us. Yeah. We are not just throwing on a cap one day and just setting out the door and, hanging a shingle. And so for listeners, this is our life work. And we've been spending money. There is a lot of value to these, to all of us who are doing, we want to do the best. And the best means that we keep up with our own learning and training and certifying. And right, it's continual. We get together and talk to other people who are doulaing and we find out about things and, oh, that's an interesting thing. Sometimes you have to show up with, tools of the trade that cost money to replace once you use them. So, again, these services are not just, random. And I always think about this. So I call myself a death midwife because I show up with herbs. I show up with a lot of things. When my birth midwife showed up, she showed up with a box of all kinds of things that were needed. And I see people supporting end of life similarly, right? We show up with our tools. So
I have a bag. Yeah,
I have a bag too, right? Yeah. I have all my tools in there that I just like pick up and head out. So
and each job you're finding new things you need too.
Yes,
that's the other thing. Yeah.
Yes, and so again, it is it's hard for us because all of us do this with so much love. And so if you're out there and you're going to ask this question to our, or your doula down the road, just really listen to, like, who am I working with? This person comes with a lot of joy in what they're doing and is going to help my family move through this. So, yeah.
And I was thinking for the people of means, you could have a little donation button.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you think this isn't enough, feel free to give me more.
Yeah, right. You can give me more. That's fine.
Yeah. Laura?
I was going to say, I think the other kind of angle of this too is that, when we talk about how much we would like to see one day, let's say like death doulas be covered by insurance, which would be great. There has to be sort of a value, like this is what this thing costs. Yeah. For that to be able to happen someday. Yeah. So I think, that's why I think it's so individual. And I think it's really necessary to have that really clear, transparent, available, like pricing. Mm-hmm. This is what this work is worth. And then also be able to, as a practitioner, say like, okay, but I'm not going to do it in this instance. I'm going to do it differently.
Yeah, you'll have discretion
for this. Right.
Yeah.
In a way, you're building a bridge for that time, perhaps, although I will say my wife, who's a music therapist, went through years and years and years of not being covered by insurance. And they finally had the state, it took years of trouble and hassle to get the state to license them so that they could be contracted through the state and through other organizations. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure you want that headache because it adds up to, it's like what happened to hospice, where hospice used to be nonprofit and share and compassion. And now it's all about the bottom line, and it's become part of the part of the elder industrial complex, and it's a lot more trouble. Most of the people I know who work in hospice spend at least half their time documenting for the
insurance forms.
Yeah.
Well, honestly, so do I, though. The amount of notes that I write on every case, because if I do wind up in court, I need to have a record of everything that happened. So, I mean, if we're doing that anyways, it would be so nice if doulas could go the same route as birth doulas, if death doulas could go and we could actually have, universities and things like that. Because if we have some sort of national level certification that actually has meaning in the sphere of care, right? That would enable us to be covered by insurance and enable doctors to trust us more and really start to help us bridge those gaps. That is, I believe it would be a net positive if we continue, but I see that as where we might be going, but it feels a long ways away right now.
It does, yeah.
Well, and I think there's such a fine line too, because I want these services to be completely and utterly accessible to everyone who needs them. A lot of my paying clients are people who really do, outside of hiring on an end-of-life doula, have good, access to healthcare and support as it is. And how do we make compassionate care accessible to people who do not have the means or who do not have insurance and do not have those things? And I'm equally wary of, and I'm okay if I'm the only one on this hill in this conversation, but I'm wary of death doula certification. It introduces this kind of gatekeeping thing of, this is work that people have been doing in their families and communities for millennia. And now we're going to say like, well, okay, but here are the XYZ things that you really need to, I don't know, have or have paid in order to be able to do it. It's a complicated conversation.
Oh, God.
It's complicated. It is really complicated. And I'll stand on your hill with you, Laura, because I want to have everyone have that access as well, right? And I want listeners to know that they could be their loved ones' death doulas as well. It's just a matter of like getting ready, being prepared, get this done before somebody needs your help and you're there for them. So, the other side of that coin is like, I would like to be compensated for the amount of work and energy that I'm spending, because I too have a family and my life, right? And I like trainings and whatnot. So yes, it's a both and.
It is. It's two things can be true at once, right? Like we really want to be able to provide service to all and have accessibility be a key issue that we can provide, but we also really want to establish ourselves as an entity, right? And so it would be nice if we could have some control over, how we are perceived in these fields. But it's a sticky wicket.
Well, thank you. That's a great conversation, and we want to keep moving. The last question we have on there that I'd like to just throw out for folks is, if somebody was looking for a death doula, what kind of questions would you suggest they ask to find a person that would match up with them? And let's start with Karen, since Karen and Lyle have been kind of quiet. Let's start with Karen and see what they have to offer in that regard.
I had a really hard time thinking about this question, because when I thought about it, it was, the number one thing is just location. Because I'm in LA County, one of the clients that I'm working with right now, when she talked to me about how she found me, she basically was looking for someone that was close enough in this area, because LA County is so vast and so spread out. So I think that's a huge issue in my area. I'm willing to drive certain distances, but that can get very tricky at the end when someone is individual, when you need to be there, more frequently around the clock or whatever it might be. So I think that is a huge question to discuss. I had difficulty with it because when I think about the questions that a client should ask me, it makes me think, well, the first question that they need to ask is to themselves, which is, what are my needs in this situation? What is it that I'm looking for? And I know that they have a hard time possibly articulating that to themselves. So my job is to guide that conversation so that they can actually come to the questions that they might need to ask me, which I can't be aware of ahead of.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good answer. Yeah.
It's tricky, but I think that's, but other questions might be, like, are you able to support MAID or VSET if that's what they're interested in? It's on our websites, but still they might want to ask us more about that and talk about it. If it's recently, I had someone inquire about a mother who had dementia. So, is it possible to do doula work with a person that has dementia? That's a huge question. And how would that be approached? And I was able to discuss that with the person and answer those questions Those are my main, and probably then just the issue of spiritual beliefs. Like they should ask, if they are concerned with having someone that is aligned with their spirituality and are worried that they might not be, they might want to bring that up to the and just find out and try to discover where you are on that path.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Layla, you actually mentioned working with somebody remotely. So what other questions might you have? Or would you suggest
me,
people
I would
ask?
say it's not that I so much have a specific question as much as the idea that the work that we do is very intimate, and you're going to be inviting us into your home and into this really sacred space. And so I want you to be as comfortable with me as possible. If you just do not like my vibe for whatever reason, you don't want me there. It's just,
okay.
so I want people to really ask me anything that is going to make them feel comfortable. And I know that's like I try and keep a social media presence, which I don't love social media. It's not my favorite place, but I do try and just keep a presence there so that if people do want to look and see, this is just her talking about whatever, so that they can kind of get that feel, because I don't want them to be uncomfortable in any way. And so, if that has to do with your spiritual beliefs or whatever kind of practical thing, you need to just ask it so that you can be as comfortable as possible.
Beautiful.
Yeah, very good. Very good. How about Myra?
I was sure you were going to go to Laura next.
I almost did.
I really think it's important for, if they start asking me a lot of questions about me, what I usually try to do is start asking them questions about them, because we know what services we can provide and they often don't. So a lot of times what I'm trying to figure out is what do they need and if I can meet that need. I offer a lot of different services, but again, to Layla's point too, personality also comes into play.
Yeah.
So you are really trying in that first phone call or that first meeting to establish what are their needs and are we going to work well together? Our communication style is going to work well together. Or if they don't jive immediately, is this something I can adjust? Because my job is to adjust to them, right? I think a lot of times what we're trying to do when we first talk with somebody is establish those two parameters. What do they need? And can I be the person that can do those things for them? Because even if I provide the services they're looking for, if we don't jive, I'm not the right person.
Right.
And Karen and I mean, we have a death doula collaborative. And we, doula is all welcome, by the way. But we really want to make sure that if it's not us, that we can put them onto somebody who might be able to help them. I think doulas should talk. I think that this is one of the key aspects, actually, is if we can't provide those services, can we help them find somebody who can, right? Because there's already too many questions for them.
Yeah. Great. Perfect. Laura, you have more to add to this conversation? I know we leave you at the end and you have to figure out what to add.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I have things to add. And I've definitely done that before where somebody's, approached me and I've referred them to somebody else because their experience is more aligned with that person's needs, which for me is, I think, the really important thing to look for, or, to try to question if you're somebody who's looking for a death doula. I think ultimately a good death doula is someone who can listen deeply and who understands the complexities involved in end-of-life care and can hold space in a way that is grounded and informed and genuinely present. So, for me, I encourage people to prioritize experience over aesthetic. I think there's a very big difference between someone who really has that skill of holding space at a bedside, who's truly witnessed and supported people through that dying process, and somebody who's kind of trying on the role like who
Mhm.
wants to embody that role.
Yeah.
I think it's important to kind of know in a death doula, like what their experience with death and dying is, and how much time have they spent doing this work. I think that, we, as death doulas, we don't need to have all the answers, but I think we should have the depth of presence and the experience to be able to navigate the uncertainties present in end of life with skill and also humility.
Yeah.
I get nervous sometimes that, we have a lot of specialties and we have a lot of add-ons and we have a lot of things that we can kind of bring to the table, but I never want the real, like, practical, hands-on, human-centered work of guiding people and their loved ones through dying to get lost in that.
Yeah. Very well put.
So
Professionalism, Yeah.
Yeah. So important.
Be a pro.
I do want to point out one thing to our listeners, that even though everyone here is female, there are actually male doulas.
And also people of color.
I was going to
Please,
say,
There's
Please.
there's all white people here, and I'm like, oh, there's all this.
yeah, we actually invited some of those other representatives who couldn't be here with us. So I did want to make that point, that that's important to know, because culturally, sometimes that can be really important. So that might be another question to ask about, what do you know about my culture specifically?
and those are the cases where I've referred out.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Which is another
I
good
think
reason
it's
to
really
have
important.
another good reason to have that cooperative and that
It is.
connection with so many.
To know other doulas, get to know other doulas, because you will not be the one for everybody.
Yeah. Well, this has been way cool.
Yes. You're my
We-
people.
The one last thing we like to do is share some poems if people brought some poetry, and or if anybody has anything else you'd like to add just before we wrap this up. Karen, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a quick plug because Laura mentioned someone who had lost a child. My doula partner, sister Phoenix, who's been on this show,
Mhm.
and I are going to be holding a child loss support group in March 23rd. It's going to be online. It's through Eventbrite. I have a flyer. So if you are aware of anyone that might benefit from that, it's going to be a 2-hour session.
Tell me when that was again.
It's on March 23rd from 4 to 6 p.m. I
I'm
would
doing
Love
good
our
after.
group, Karen. Oh, I'm so excited for you guys. With the best girls. Love it.
All right. Well, did anybody bring a poem they'd like to share? Or did everybody bring a poem?
I have one. I'm
Good.
not sure it's the right tone,
Okay. It's your choice.
but I'll read it if you guys want.
Give it a shot.
Yeah.
Poetry is always
Okay.
welcome, though.
Are you guys familiar with Wendell Berry?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So this is entitled Grief. The morning comes, the old woman, a spot of soot where she has touched her cheek, tears on her face, builds a fire, sets water to boil, puts the skillet on. The man in his middle years, bent by the work he has done toward the work he will do, weeps as he eats, bread in his mouth, tears on his face. They shape the day for its passing as if absent from it, for what needs care, caring, feeding what must be fed. To keep them, there are only the household's remembered ways, etched thin and brittle by their tears. It is a sharp light that lights the day now. It seems to shine, beyond eyesight, also in another day where the dead have risen and are walking away, their backs forever turned. What look is in their eyes? What do they say as they walk into the fall and flow of light? It seems that they must know where they are going, and the living must go with them, not knowing, a little way. And the dead go on, not turning, knowing, but not saying. And the living turn back to their day, their grieving, and staying.
Yeah.
I found that the other day. I was flipping through the book, and not the other day, for my last appearance with you guys. And I was like,
Okay. That's
I
good.
didn't know Wendell wrote something that, so.
Thank you. Very beautiful. I think somebody else sent me something late and said, I don't know if it's too late or not, but it's never too late. Go ahead, Karen.
It's very short. This is a jisei, which is a Japanese death poem. I don't know if you're familiar, but they're poems that people write at the very moment that they're passing and of awareness and extreme lucidity. Not even for a moment do things stand still. witness color in the trees.
Wow.
Yeah, stay with that for a minute, right? Thank you. Diella, Laura, did you
I
find a
have a
poem you
little
wanted to share?
something, not exactly a poem, but I was on that social media last night and I saw somebody speaking. His name is Alakved Menon, and he was telling the story of his grandfather's death. And there was just a couple things that he said. He said, no one had ever told me that dying is the longest verb. Story, poem, and song so flippantly use the word died as if dying is something that just happens simply and immediately, not something that unfurls, that festers. And I just heard that and I thought that is why we have death doulas, because people don't know. They don't know how big this process is. And I just thought, I'm like, oh, that's talking about my job. And the part that I'm supposed to be doing. So I loved it.
Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful.
Very, very good. Very beautiful. All right. Laura, anything or carry on?
Yeah, I've always got Mary Oliver
Oh, yeah.
pulled up.
Mary Oliver.
Saint.
Saint
She's
Mary.
my go-to. And I can't remember if this is the one that I read when I was on the podcast before, if it was something else, but this was kind of the one that spoke to me today. But it's Mary Oliver's The World I Live In. I have refused to live locked in the orderly house of reasons and proofs. The world I live in and believe in is wider than that. And anyway, what's wrong with maybe? You wouldn't believe what once or twice I have seen. I'll just tell you this. Only if there are angels in your head will you ever possibly see one.
Poetry is so great, so perfect. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been such a beautiful conversation, and I'm so glad we could do this. And like I said, I'm kind of glad that we get to put it out sooner than whatever it was on the schedule, because it's so important. I really want people to be able to hear it. And we do have a premium version with some teachers talking about what it takes to become a doula. So anybody who is listening who'd like to become a doula, you just have to subscribe, which is relatively inexpensive, and you can listen to that premium version as well. So thank you again, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining us on the End of Life Conversations. We appreciate you and look forward to sharing our stories. We encourage you to subscribe to have access to premium episodes and extra resources. Links to our guests and their recommendations and a transcript of this episode will be in the podcast notes.
Yes, thank you so much. And please tell all your friends. Follow us on social media, and again, consider subscribing for some excellent premium content. We want to acknowledge that the music we are using was composed and produced by Charles Heastand. We also want to acknowledge that we live on unceded lands that have been cared for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples who are still here.